Well, kia ora whānau. This session 12, we're looking at gospel narratives. When we were together recently, we talked around the way that the gospel might be good news for our communities. And in this session, we're looking at the different ways that the Jesus story has been told and the ways that we articulate that to our neighbourhoods in a way that makes sense to people. And so to begin with, we look at this phrase, which you'll look at on your sheet there, that is evangelion, which is a Greek word which is used there, you can see in Mark 1:14-15, Matthew 4:23, and Luke 4:18. And that Luke 4:18 is that classic verse which many of us have talked about quite a few times, which says, Jesus says, "I've come to bring good news to the poor, release for the captives, recovery of sight for the blind, and liberty for those who are oppressed." So that little phrase, good news, that's the evangelion. And like many things that Jesus did, he was borrowing phrases from the culture around him and subverting them or changing them. So this phrase, evangelion, or the good news, was actually used by the Roman Empire. And so when Rome would conquest or liberate an area, maybe they'd take over a country or a city, there would be some news that came out that they called the evangelion, the good news, and it was of how the new reign of Rome would change the nature of life in that city. So the good news might have been like, there's going to be more bread, more bread's going to be coming, there's going to be aqueducts, more water's going to be coming, there's going to be circuses, there's going to be shows on, taxes are going up or going down, this is the new religion that we all follow. Basically, here's the way of life it will look now that your area is under the empire or the kingdom of Rome. So this was the good news. They said there's a new king in town, a new ruler, a new Caesar, and here is how life will look. This is the good news. So Jesus borrows this because he talks of himself as a kingdom who brings a king. He's equally saying, as I come into your life, as I come into your world, as I come into your neighborhood, here is the good news of how life will change. So in his manifesto, his good news was, guys, there's going to be good news for the poor, the captives are getting out of jail, the blind are going to see, and there'll be freedom. So those is kind of his this is what you can expect with me as king now that I roll in and become king and lord of your life. And so similarly, we can sort of ask, well, what is the good news for our neighbourhoods if Jesus was to roll into Reiwa South today, or into Te Aro in Wellington, or into Whakatū Nelson, and was suddenly to become mayor or king? What would be the good news that he would declare? What would change? And I think for a group like ours, it's very natural to think in those terms. We talk a lot about neighbourhood ministry here, but I think before we can talk about what the good news is for our neighbourhoods and our regions, we all have to recover a sense in which this is good news for us. And for those of us who have had a faith for a long time, sometimes that can get a little bit lost for us. And so we're quite bad at evangelism, but the reason we're kind of bad at evangelism or evangelion, telling the good news, is because we sort of need to reconnect with how this is good news in our lives. We need to become familiar with those stories again. I can remember for me, my moment I came to faith, I was 13. I was at high school and outspoken, as I've remained, and not necessarily easy to make friends, not very liked, but I got invited to youth group a couple of times by some nice people, and one night I went out for a walk on my own, and I was feeling desperately lonely, and I just sort of started to talk to God, if there was a God there. And just as I was walking through my home suburb, began to weep and to talk. And I didn't hear God say anything, but I did have in that moment a sense that I was being listened to in a way that no other adult or no other peer would at the time. And I can just remember that being deeply good news to me at the time, that this God I knew that I had his full attention and he was there for me. And that's one of kind of many stories in my life where I can look back and go, oh, that was the good news of Jesus, that he cared about us not know his 13-year-old. And when others didn't listen or didn't notice, he did. And anyway, that's just one little story, but I think for all of us, before we kind of wrestle with theologically what the good news is, or, what it maybe means in the depths of the scriptures, we all have to reconnect with something of what Christ has done for us. And so sometimes when we're in person, we do an activity which you could do on your own, which is called storylines, where you sort of map out your life, and then along the way you sort of mark moments of joy or pain or struggle or transformation, and you notice where God was in them. But I think what we want to begin to do as we come together for this session is we're going to go into breakout rooms in a second. And as we're in breakout rooms, why don't we begin in those rooms by just taking 3 or 4 minutes in prayerful silence? Someone could pray, take a moment, and then just inviting people. Can you recall a moment? Can you reconnect if you need to? Some of you may not need to reconnect. Some of you, this might be very obvious. But can you reconnect where Christ coming as King into your life, the coming of his kingdom, was good news and changed things? So that's our first thing. Let's spend some moments in prayer and let's share with one another a moment where we just really recognize this as good news, and then we'll come back together. So as we share those good news stories together, the evangelion with one another, we remember our story, our testimony, which is important. And I think for any kind of sense of sharing the good news in our neighbourhood, we need to be familiar with our own testimonies of God's goodness. But then secondly, we need to connect with the big story, the meta-narrative, the story in Scripture of where God has been healing and reconciling and redeeming all things throughout human history. And so it's the holding together of those stories, of our own story, and of the big story in the scriptures, where we begin to get good at sharing this good news and this evangelion in a way that people become captivated and intrigued to want to know more about. But I think the thing is, sometimes we can think that there's kind of one big story, like there's one way of telling the Jesus story, but the story of what Christ has done for us is really multifaceted, and has is good news to different people at different times in different ways. Christ dying on the cross didn't just do one thing, but did many things and reordered the cosmos and people's lives in lots of creative ways. And so throughout the history of the church, if you look back, the church has told the story of what Christ has done in different ways throughout that history. And so similarly, as we look in our neighbourhood, it's not that we are looking to tell a new story, but we're wanting to connect with narratives or stories about what Jesus has done for us in a way that uniquely makes sense to our neighbourhood and where we are. And so what I thought I would do here is I just want to share sort of 3 motifs, 3 ideas we see in Scripture of what Christ has done for us as different angles that we may feel confident to share in our neighbourhood. And there are more beyond this, but these are 3 you can sort of think about to begin with. And the first of those is the unknowable God made knowable. A few years ago here in my suburb of Brooklyn, I ended up running being part of a meditation group. And from that meditation group, some people wanted to explore faith. So I started a group called Eastern Jesus. And the idea behind that group was that we would talk about Jesus through an Eastern or an Indigenous perspective and try and liberate him from kind of a set of Western assumptions. And so for that, I chose the Gospel of John, which begins with that passage, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh, and in the message it says the Word moved into the neighbourhood. And that was a really interesting angle to take with people from a New Age or an Eastern perspective, because something they would regularly talk about is what the universe was saying to them. They'd say, oh, the universe called to me, or the universe spoke to me. I don't know if you've ever heard this language before, but the universe was big to them. And the interesting thing there in John 1 is that when it says the Word became flesh, in the Greek, that word is logos, which kind of means like the connection and the cohesion and the holding together of all things. It kind of has this overlap with the universe. And so in this Bible study, I was able to sit with them and say, hey, the universe is great, but did you know the universe actually became human? You don't have to wonder if there is, you don't have to wonder if the universe is angry with you anymore. You don't have to wonder if the universe is interested. You don't just have to throw out intentions or prayers into the ether and hope that something happens. But the gospel says that the universe became flesh in Christ Jesus and dwelled among us. So you see there in that first one, the unknowable God made knowable. In the incarnation, Christ becomes Emmanuel, God with us. He steps down from safety with the Father into the mess of our lives. And he does not come in power, but in human vulnerability to the point where we were able to kill him. As Paul wrote, we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. And so there is a sense here that we follow a God who did not avoid the mess of our lives or the mess of our neighborhoods or the frailty of being human or sickness or fear or temptation or any of those things, but entered into those spaces. And so God is not afraid of the messy corners of our lives, nor is he afraid of the messy corners of our neighborhood. And this God who felt like a bearded man in the sky or just a universal force, we can know as one who loves us, who knows us by name, and who calls us by name. So that's that first one, the unknowable made knowable. The second one I like to look at is around this idea of absorbing and transforming. You know, it's really interesting whenever there's a natural disaster in New Zealand. I've noticed a trend to what we often do when the news comes out the day after. Because day one will be what happened. Like, what happened here? Was there an earthquake? Was there a flood? Did anyone die? Was anyone harmed? How many houses were lost? What's the economic impact? All that kind of thing. So you have that. But then day two, predictably, is always, who can we blame? And sometimes I look at it, and sometimes there are things where there are people who didn't do their job. But often I look at some of the things and I just think, who was supposed to be so powerful that this weather event wouldn't happen? Like, can we really actually blame someone for this? And do we just need to blame someone because it makes us feel better about the lack of control that we have in the world and our lives sometimes? And I think it's quite a human tendency to need to put our blame and our pain somewhere. It's like there's so much we feel within our hearts. There's so much discomfort or pain or the problems feel so big that we need someone to put them on because we can't just sit with the difficulty or the pain of what it is. And I think this is what you see throughout the scriptures, and it's what you see through human history, is this continual thing of putting our pain on a scapegoat, on another person. We see this at the moment through politics, where we're putting our pain on minorities, or we're putting our pain on immigrants. And I like what a friend of mine from Aussie, Dave Andrews, says. He says, unless your pain is transformed, it will be transmitted. Unless your pain is transformed, it will be transmitted. And so there is this ceaseless back and forth of violence, this transmission of pain and violence that we do to one another, sometimes with fists, sometimes with words, sometimes through wars and with missiles, the ceaseless transmission of violence. But one of the things that Jesus does in dying on the cross is that he puts an end to that human cycle of tit-for-tat violence. And he dies and receives that violence, saying, it is finished. And then he leaves it in the grave at his resurrection. And I like what it says here with Ronald Rolheiser in his book Sacred Fire, it says, rather, Jesus takes away the tensions and sins of the community by absorbing them, carrying them, transforming them. And looking at his death, they understood this. He took in hatred, held it, transformed it, and gave back love. He took in bitterness, held it, transformed it, and gave back graciousness. He took in curses, held them, transformed them, and gave back blessings. And he took in murder, held it, transformed it, and gave back forgiveness. So part of the good news that we can share with people is that we all need somewhere for our pain to go, but that on the cross, Christ is able to absorb all of that, so we no longer need to work it out on one another. We no longer need to live in a religion of violence, because we can be in a religion of love together, because Christ has absorbed and transformed our pain. So that's that second one there. And then the third one is around reconciled relationships. A few years ago, I got invited to share at a high school social studies class, and it was a group of year 10s, and they were looking at different religions, so they were having different religious leaders come in. And they had a Muslim imam the week before. I think they had a Sikh coming later on, but I was ready to come in. And Wellington High School is a very liberal secular school, not very warm to Christianity normally. So I'd prepared some of the topics I thought they would talk about around gender and sexuality, around colonisation, things like that. And I was surprised when I got into the room, because the things they wanted to talk about were not those things at all. And I think it was the second question, this kid's hand went up, and he just said, "What is sin?" And I thought, heck, that is not the question that I was expecting from this classroom. But I remembered in that moment a definition which I find incredibly compelling. And it's the idea that we were made for good relationships with God, for ourselves, for others, and with others, and with creation. And so sin is the fracturing of relationships. And so I was able to say to them, I said to them, hey, how do you feel like our relationship is with creation? And immediately these kids start saying, oh, we've got climate change, we've got pollution, we've got plastic in our oceans. And they right away said, yeah, we have a broken relationship with creation. I said, yeah. How do you think our relationship is with others? And they said, well, they said you could look at Ukraine, you could look at the time what was happening in Syria and in Iraq at a global level. They could see that we don't have good relationships with each other. But then they talked about domestic violence, and they talked about our political polarization, the way that people who vote for different political parties can't really get along with each other, the way that we're all fracturing down. They said, yeah, we don't have good relationships with each other. And then I said, what about your relationships with yourself? Like, how do you feel about yourself? And some of them said, well, everyone's anxious. Everyone's anxious at the moment. Heaps of people are on medication. Like, we're all struggling to love ourselves and to see ourselves in a good way. And so I said, well, then the only one really left is God. And you may not believe in God, but I said, if there is a God, how do you think that God feels about you? And they said, well, I think if there is a God, he probably doesn't like me. And so these young people were able to identify for themselves the fracturing of these four relationships: broken relationship with creation, with others, with self, and with God. And so then I was able to say, well, that's what sin is. And Christ died to reconcile everything back to him, and through him to reconcile all of us to each other. So that first Colossians 1, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So that we are called into restored relationship with God through Jesus, and then that creates a way where the sin and broken relationships can be overcome to be in good and right relationship with self, with others, and with creation. And so just to go back over those, I know there's quite a lot in there, but what I'm trying to do here is lay out for you some different ways of looking at what Jesus has done, and just to simplify them. The first one of those really is the God who we thought was unknowable is knowable and is with us. The second is that in Jesus, our violence and our pain can find an ending and be transformed. And then the third is that through Christ, our relationships with God, with self, with others, and with creation can be reconciled and restored. And so as we go into breakout rooms again, I want you to ever think about the neighborhood that you are in, and think about whether there is a particular one of those ways of looking at what Jesus has done, at the gospel, which might be good news to your neighborhood, and why. What is it about that story which to people would sound like, wow, Jesus can make a difference and can bring good news to this place. And obviously there are many other ways of talking about what Christ has done too, but this is just three which might help to provoke our imagination so that the next time we are asked to speak about our faith, we'll feel more confident that we know this truly is good news for people.